Welcome to Come and See, your podcast for finding truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. With host and founder Richard Case and co-host and retreat leader Kathy Ricconi. Join us every weekday at this time to discuss news, spend time in the Word, and receive answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. And now your host, Richard Case.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is End Times Friday, and this is part two that we're having with a good friend, Eric, who's right now in Jerusalem, having to deal with the sirens that come off periodically to go down to the bomb shelters there. We're day 5 of the Iran war. We had a great discussion last time about just what is going on, why did they do this together with the United States, and what's all going on over there. And Denny, I think you had a great question as we've kind of finished that segment as we go into maybe a different topic about this. But why don't you go ahead and start that, because I think it is a worthy thing to consider.
So Eric talked at the last session about just all of what's going on in Israel related to Iran and the other neighbors that are being attacked by Iran. There's this sense that it's been very quiet from the Iranian proxies, the Hezbollah, the Houthis, and there are still assumed to be large stockpiles of missiles, maybe even some big ones in both places. Is there any sense, Eric, that there's some reason for that quiet? There's some counteroffensive that's being planned, or the oil that needs to move through the Straits of Hormuz for the world to function? Are any of those things still at risk while the focus is on Iran directly and the defense of the other neighboring countries?
Well, let's just start with what's really happening, and then maybe go into how and why. So as of now, or as of 2 days ago, Hezbollah launched a series of missiles into Israel, and did damage to one of the structures in one of the towns. No one was hurt, and Israel basically declared war. So at this point in time, there are Israeli battalions on the Lebanese side of the border. The Lebanese army was informed in advance. The Lebanese army withdrew from southern Lebanon to northern Lebanon. There's literally a war going on. The Lebanese government has declared Hezbollah a persona non grata. That is, that they're an alien agent inside their midst, which means that they're being really not physically attacked, but the Lebanese government wants them gone. Syrian army, the newly constructed Syrian army under, I forget the guy's name, Shara. They've amassed at the Lebanese border. Why? Because they have no plans to attack, of course. They want to prevent Hezbollah from entering Syria as an escape route once Israel starts attacking. So basically, at this point in time, Hezbollah is in a pincer motion and squeezed. And Israel is going to squeeze them hard, real hard. Israel warned that any Iranian citizens that are inside Lebanon or members of the Revolutionary Guard better evacuate, because if they're found, they're going to be killed. And there's just there are tanks now, Israeli tanks inside Lebanon, and they're just going to go after Hezbollah with total dogged determination to eradicate them. So the other big proxy is, of course, the Houthis down in Yemen. And the obvious question is, well, where are they? Why aren't they doing something? Because they were really they didn't do any damage to Israel. They did some damage to the shipping routes, and they were mostly like a mosquito to Israel. But they be an annoyance, and they're really quiet at the moment. And I don't know the answer. There are some theories based on some things I've read that Israel took out the entire leadership of the Houthis, and the IDF has plans for the Houthis should they do something. I don't know all the details, but there have been very clear messages sent to the Houthis that if you enter this thing, you're going to regret it. Big time.
And Israel has the capacity to fight on all these fronts if it needs to. I guess there are different kinds of military assets necessary for each one.
Yes, that's true. But the Israeli Air Force is active both now in Lebanon and in Iran.
When do you foresee the Straits of Hormuz opening back up and having the oil flow again?
I think I'm just sort of relying on what I'm hearing from the United States, and because that's sort of their control point. And I think it's going to matter of 2 or 3 days. Right now, there are a lot of ships anchored right outside the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, waiting to, I guess, go in. and either load or unload. I'm not sure exactly. And so all that shipping's accumulating. And by the way, there is a very small country in the Far East whose capital happens to be Beijing. It's very, very interested in seeing that strait opened as well, because they import 90% of the oil produced by Iran. And they have told Iran, don't you dare block the Straits of Hormuz. Now, their benefactor, China.
Will the in that regard, who are the suppliers of oil in that area? Is Iran going to continue to be a supplier, and who else is a supplier?
Well, Iran gets around the sanctions by using every tanker, every ship has a beacon called AIS that identifies itself in the satellite. And, therefore, people can identify who is where and from what country they're registered with and so on, whether they're a tanker, a container ship, or what kind of ship they are. And Iran, of course, turns these things off, as does Russia, because they're getting around the sanctions to get their oil to various locations. And when they can, they capture these ships, but they're very hard to capture in the open sea. So right now, 90% of the oil produced by Iran goes to China and 10% goes to Iran. That's what's going on right now.
Who supplies the United States and other people from that region?
I don't know all the details of the breakdown. I'm guessing Saudi Arabia. I don't know. Qatar mostly produces natural gas, and a large part of that goes to Europe. So I don't know the breakdown of each country and how much goes to which destination.
Yeah, sometime, by the way, we'll have you made a statement earlier about trying to set up a regime change that when Bush tried to set up a democracy in Iraq, it was completely misled. They were never going to make it that way, and then they could have actually had Iraq be a tremendous producer of oil and benefit from the economics of that. So it'll be interesting to talk about that sometime.
No, Iraq produces oil, and it produces oil in the area called around what's called Basra, which is near Kuwait, which is near the Gulf. Yeah. And the other area produces up in the Kurdish area, in the northern part of Iraq, and they're pumping oil. By the way, at some point we should have a discussion about the Kurds in the Kurdish areas. Yeah. Maybe it's not enough for this conversation, but they're going to be a player in this game right now.
Yeah, I think we'll get into that maybe our next time we get together to talk about how is all this going to sort itself out amongst the Muslim nation, first of all, and how that's going to impact U.S. and Europe. But Denny, you read Eric's Substack where he gave a pretty good explanation with a beautiful kind of stories about it. Why don't you summarize that and then set the stage for some discussion questions on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, it would be great. I don't know if we have the ability to do this, Rich, but to give the audience the ability to link to Eric's Substack, because he's back to what looks like every day or two he's going to try and do an update, and they're very, very comprehensive. If you've read his stuff with lots and lots of links and attachments, depending on just how ambitious.
Okay. Eric, why don't you give that address again so our audience can pick it up?
If I can probably send it to Denny, the link, and then he can then forward it out. Does that work?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay,
we'll do that. So in this one, Eric was tying a bit of a parallel between the festival of Purim that is being celebrated by Jews all over the world this week, right at the same time as this attack is taking place. Part of this was Eric's view of how real and profound evil is in the world, and that it's represented. I was very moved by that as I read that.
Hey, and Denny, before you do all that, explain what is the Festival of Purim.
Let's let Eric do it, right?
Okay.
I think that would be the best way of doing it, and why you chose to write about that on this day 4.
Okay. So maybe your listeners should first appreciate that I regard myself as a secular Jew. I do go to synagogue. My wife is what they call a modern Orthodox Jew. So she truly believes that God is ever present and has a very big hand in everything that happens in our life. I don't share that view, and so she's strictly kosher. And we're strictly, when I'm with her, we're strictly observant of the Sabbath. Something your readers might be interested in. We went to go hear Ambassador Huckabee, who's the U.S. ambassador to Israel, give a speech maybe 2 weeks ago. And in it, he was talking about many subjects. It was like a town hall meeting. And most of the audience were English speakers, mostly Americans living here. And during the course of what he said, someone asked him about what his favorite activity is here. And he says, I enjoy being invited for the Sabbath. And he says, because what you guys have created or preserved over your millennia in the Jewish faith. This Sabbath thing is something that you guys need to preserve and cannot let go of. It says, I remember the days, and I do too, by the way, and I'm sure you do, Denny. In St. Louis, they had the blue laws, remember?
Yeah.
And on Sundays, everything was closed. And why was that a good thing? I mean, even though I'm a Jewish, and I don't go to church, because when you close the markets and you close the theaters, guess what? You have to spend time with your family. And the phones get turned off, and you actually can have a conversation with your parents, your siblings, or your children, your cousins, your friends. You can go out and you can connect people. And when you have an always on 24/7, 7 days a week, you lose it. And he says, my favorite time is on the Sabbath when I'm with the families and the parents, especially the father blesses the children. I've also heard that same comment from many evangelical Christians who come visiting Israel, and they say one of their favorite experiences, and they say that's it as well. And I do that when I'm with my children. My wife does it with her children when they're here. It's very special. So getting back to your question, which is about the holiday of Purim. So everything here has symbols. We live in Jerusalem, and everything carries meaning, and everything you walk, wherever you walk here, there's meaning beneath your feet. And there were people that thought, well, if we're going to have a war, we're going to have it now. I always thought it was going to happen sometime between Saturday morning and Monday night. Given my judgment was made mostly because of the positioning of the aircraft carriers and where the negotiations were heading. I was convinced that Trump really wanted to have the negotiations succeed if possible. People here in Israel thought it would happen kind of right now because of the holiday of Purim. So what is Purim, and what is this meaning? So Purim is a remembrance. It's a very happy holiday in Israel. People dress up in costumes like they do in the United States on Halloween. People exchange gifts.
We did when we were young too.
Yes, people are commanded to drink. I mean, drink alcohol, and that's why Rabbi Ephraim couldn't make it today, because he had drunk a little bit too much. My wife and I shared some ouzo, which is the Greek extraction from anise. Any case, so why is it a happy holiday, and what is the holiday about? Roughly in the year 470 BC, the Persian Empire was the eminent empire of the day. And as your listeners may realize, Persia is what is today Iran. The language they speak in Iran is Farsi, and they consider themselves Persians. And their culture, their history goes back a long way. The Persian people, for your listeners who know them, they're very creative, they're very entrepreneurial, they're very reasonable people, and if left to their own, they could have a very successful country. So in 470 BC, there was the king, in Hebrew, his name was Ahasuerus, but in their language, Xerxes. So for those of your listeners who are movie fans, you may remember there was a movie called 300. It starred Gerard as King Leonidas of the Spartan nation, who took 300 Spartans and fought against the invading Persian Empire that was trying to come and invade Greece. Those are basically true events. The king of Persia was depicted in that movie, and that was the king at that time, is King Xerxes. His great-great-grandfather was King Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great was the one who created the Persian Empire out of the remains of the Babylonian Empire. He's well remembered in Jewish history because he permitted the Jews to go back and reestablish the second temple. So that was Xerxes' great-great-grandfather. So Xerxes had a concubine, like all kings of this day, and one of the queens, his concubine, was a Jewish woman named Esther. And Esther had an uncle named Mordecai. And the story goes that the vizier, or the king, the chief advisor to King Xerxes, was a guy named Haman, who became very jealous of the Jewish population living in Persia at the time, that was doing quite well as a population, and wanted to kill them and destroy them. So he conspired against them. And so Mordecai and his niece Esther had to come up with a plan to spoil this plan. And it'd take too long for me to go into all the events that happened during this period. But in the end, what happened was they convinced King Xerxes that in fact Haman was the problem. King Xerxes had Haman killed, and the Jews celebrated this holiday. And so that's why it's a joyous holiday. And so why does it carry meaning? It carries, as your listeners may know, every Sabbath on the Saturday morning, and then also Thursday morning, in the Jewish faith, they read a portion of the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, okay? And until during the whole calendar lunar year, they get through the whole thing. And so right now we're in the middle of the book of Exodus, talking about, the departure from Egypt. But on this Saturday, right before Purim, they interrupt and they read a passage from Deuteronomy. And let me bring it up so I have it here. No, wrong one. Hold on. Here we go. See it? Oh, give me one sec. I'm trying to pull it up now, and it's just. Okay, here we go. Now I've got it. So there was a bomb, a missile that landed in a community about 30 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem called Beit Shemesh, and it hit a synagogue, and 6 people were killed. This happened 2 days ago. And there was a fragment that ended up in a Torah scroll in the synagogue. And people are saying this is sort of some kind of sign from God or something, because the fragment happened to be on the passage that was called Zachor. And this passage talks about the Exodus from Egypt. And let me just read it in English to your listeners. It sort of reads, you shall remember what the nation of Amalek did to you when you were on your departure from Egypt, how on the way the nation attacked you by surprise and mutilated the weak and the old at your rear. You must obliterate the remembrance of Amalek from beneath heaven. So the sages, and what I do, even though I don't consider myself an Orthodox Jew, I do read what, not as extensively as many of my contemporaries do, but I do read the commentary of the rabbis of the different portions, especially the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Sachs, who I think is an incredible writer. And he wrote, and many other sages wrote, that this passage about Amalek. So the question gets asked, and this is often how things get done by the rabbis over time, is why did God tell the Hebrews as they were leaving, they had just crossed the Red Sea, and just when they get to the other side, within a couple of days or a week, Amalek attacks, this nation of Amalek, to try to annihilate them, and they get defeated. So after this passage, why would God tell the Hebrews that you shall forgive the Egyptians for what they did to you, but you shall never forgive Amalek? Okay, and so they try to explain it in the following way. The bottom line is it's teaching us that there's this concept of absolute evil. When you talk to many of your friends, especially in the progressive line of thinking in the United States, there's always a reason why someone did something terrible. He had a terrible childhood, or he was robbed of something, he had a terrible father, or she was raped as a kid or abused as a kid, and this is why they do what they do. And the Palestinians do what they do because they are terrible injustice done to them, and there's always a reason why people do what they do. And this is telling us, guess what? Yes, there are times when people do things because some terrible things were done to them. But there are also times when there's such a thing called evil, and evil exists. And that's what the lesson is teaching us, that there is such a thing as evil. And when you encounter evil, the only way to deal with it is to do your best to eradicate it. There's no other way to deal with the evil. And the reason why we're told to forgive the Egyptians is they did not understand what they had done to you. And this is an example, okay, they didn't know what they were doing. So you shall forgive them. But those who seek evil against you deserve your wrath, not your forgiveness. And so that's what I wrote about. And why is it relevant to today? Because we are now encountering what many of us would view as the modern day Haman, former Ali Khamenei, the former supreme leader, who is the leader of this death cult. I mean, there's no other word for it. It's a death cult. They believe in this coming of this Mahdi, and the best way to bring it about is through the death of many people. So for them, 30,000 of their own people killing them is nothing. It's nothing. It's part of the price of admission to the theater. It's nothing to. I mean, there's also this passage that we're instructed to read. Let me see if I can find it. I also wrote about this in my passage. I can't find it now. But in Deuteronomy, there's. Hold on. It was in my previous stack. I'm sorry to put you through this, but give me a sec.
While you're looking for that, Rich, the other thing, obviously, in the book of Esther, there's this, near the end, and I think it's chapter 4, when Mordecai says to Esther this famous thing about maybe you were born for
such a time as this.
Silent for just a time as this.
Yeah.
And That's sort of similar to the question I think that, the United States is asking today. Why are we doing this now? I think as believers, we might say this is one of those, such a time as this issue about either remaining silent or acting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when your listeners are thinking about Iran and how the Islamic Republic thinks and these Ayatollahs think, so in the post I did before that, I cited a passage from Deuteronomy in Hebrew, Devarim, which is the 5th book. And in it, Moses is basically reiterating the laws and preparing the people to enter the promised land, okay, before he died. And so this passage reads as the following: See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice and hold fast to him, for the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So
Deuteronomy 30, by the way.
it is here in Israel, and amongst most of the Jewish community that I know, secular and religious, we worship life. That's why getting the last hostage out of the hands of that death cult called Hamas was so critical to Israel, is because we honor life. It's critical to us that like the Marine motto, Semper Fi, you never leave a man behind. And amongst the people in this death cult, you have the Islamic Republic of Iran, you have ISIS, you have Al Qaeda, you have Taliban, you have Hamas, you have the PLO. They all worship death. They teach their children to worship death. The finest thing their children can become is not a doctor, not a lawyer, but a shaheed, someone who commits a act of martyrdom by killing somebody else, especially a Jew. They pay tons of money to people who kill. So this is a real battle of civilization, and people who don't understand this are missing out. Europe is just like, I don't know where they are, and I don't know what they're teaching in colleges in the United States. I somehow think and hope there's a chance the United States can bounce back from this whole DEI woke phenomenon, to realize that it is the preserver right now of Western civilization. And people should be proud of Western civilization. The level of poverty is the lowest in mankind's history because of Western civilization. The standard of living is higher on the average across the entire world, not just among specific few, because of Western civilization, because of this Judeo-Christian principle of helping others. You think if China becomes the eminent power in this world, that they're going to give a damn about how other people think? It's all going to be about how do we suck in as much wealth to China as we can, because that's what's important to them. And so somehow the youth in the United States needs to wake up and understand that their legacy that they're inheriting of Western civilization should be cherished, preserved, and boosted, not discarded or stamped on, which is what you see. I mean, every time a student shouts, globalize the intifada, they're in the death cult. And that's how everybody should think. You've been put into the death cult, and all you want to do is become a martyr. And you're going to bring down the world if more people start thinking that way. And that's why, I think faith is very important. I think that to live in Israel, I believe, you have to be incredibly optimistic and believe in the future, or have an incredible reliance on faith, or both, because the odds have always been against us, but somehow we prevailed. My wife would, if she were with me, she would tell you it's all God's hand. I'm not so sure, but that's what she would say.
You're a work in process there, like the rest of us.
And this is coming from a secular Jew.
Yeah. Is there an understanding, since this happens to be, the festival by the broader population, that this is kind of an interesting, convergence of that moment and what's happening?
Yeah, everything's symbolic here. Everything. It carries a lot of symbolism for the Jews here, because like there people was, I'm not sure everyone here would say that, but there's this I've heard this one theme, people talking about, well, we need to repay the Persians our debt. They let us come back and rebuild our second temple, and we need to pay our debt back to them by releasing them from this yoke of this death cult. Actually, it shouldn't be called the Islamic Republic. Everyone should just call it the death cult, because that's really what it is. Hamas is the death cult. Yeah, that's what they are.
Yeah, that was interesting. Back in 1998, I had I actually had a lunch with Netanyahu, with a bunch of Christian CEOs, and we asked him about, what he's thought about, at that time they were having intifada often, and they didn't have all the things to protect themselves going yet, and they could get bombed in, supermarkets and stuff. And he said, well, think about how you guys fight wars. Eventually, your enemy values life, and they decide that's enough. They said, our enemy values death. And he said, that's unwinnable because their view is to kill everybody in sight, including themselves, and they don't value life at all. So we can never come to an agreement about how to proceed because of the different evil, what they're evil, purely evil, and we're trying to live a good life. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Well, one can have hope. They're in the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia. They used to, there was a thing called Wahhabi, and it was from the Wahhabi sect that all the Al Qaeda came out of. Al Qaeda is a death cult.
Yeah.
And Saudi Arabia has finally figured out that this is leading them nowhere.
Right.
I think it was after 9/11 they started to try to change, and they've changed their school system. Now, I don't think their general population is very happy with Israel, because all the propaganda they've gotten over their networks comes over Al Jazeera, and they think that we're perpetrators of war crimes, because they get this slanted view on what really happened. They're trying to do, in the United Arab Emirates, their children are taught about the Holocaust, that it happened. Not, Hamas and the PLO, when they teach their kids, they have it both ways. Hitler didn't finish the job, and the Holocaust never happened. They teach it all at the same time. Yeah. I don't know how they do that, and somehow they do that. So it's possible. It's possible. And Persia wasn't always this way. I mean, before the Khomeini came in '79, it wasn't a death cult. I wouldn't say that there was a split in the population whether Israel was an ally or not. But it wasn't a death cult. So these things are indoctrinated. They can be undoctrinated. It's not a forever thing.
Yeah. The next time we get together, we'll pick up and talk about, well, first we'll know more about the status of what happened, obviously with Iran, but it'd be interesting to talk about the whole scenario of all these different Arab states. Where does it wind up based on, what now has happened and reshuffling everything? And like you say, there's moderates and, they still have a pure, Muslim belief, but it's moderated. So we'll be interesting. Eric, thank you so much for giving us your perspective. Thank you for writing that great Substack and kind of recognizing, that I guess as your wife views it, is that God's up to something and maybe there is meaning here. So that's what we would view it.
She certainly believes that God has a path for this. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is all His hand at work.
Yeah. And thank you for the courage to write about that, by the way. And we're so proud of that. So we appreciate it. People, if you have a question about any of this, send it into questions@abideministry.com. And we will continue to pick this up because it's very dynamic. And as this happens, we'll get Eric and Rabbi back on and keep talking about the very interesting implications. And I've got some big questions about, as this resorts itself out, and let's say Iran is kind of neutralized, in the Bible it says that the world still comes against Israel. So I'd like to talk about that as to where that comes from. So anyway, Eric, thank you so much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Come and See, your podcast for truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. Send us your questions and comments and tune in tomorrow for more answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. Remember, God's will is best and none better. His truth brings peace in this world of chaos.